for this refers to the line made up of the succession of points at which the magnetic needle ceases to indicate. Trans. The position of the islands of Pilstart and Howe was next rectified, and on the 13th November the lights of Port Jackson, or Sydney, were at last sighted. Freycinet had fully expected to find the town enlarged during the 16 years that had passed since his last visit, but his astonishment was great indeed at the sight of a large and prosperous European city, set down in the midst of scenery which might almost be called wild. But as the travellers made excursions in various directions, fresh signs of the progress which the colony had made were forced on their attention. Fine roads carefully kept, bordered with the eucalyptus, styled by Peru, the giant of the Australian forests, well-constructed bridges, distances marked by milestones, proved the existence of a well-organised local administration, whilst the charming cottages, the numerous herds of cattle, and the carefully cultivated fields bore testimony to the industry and perseverance of the new colonists. Governor Macquarie and the principal authorities of the province vied with each other in showing attention to the French travellers, who, however, persisted in declining all but a single invitation, lest the work of the mission should not receive its fair share of attention. The entertainment given by the governor took place at his country house at Parramatta, whither the officers of the expedition proceeded by water, accompanied by a military band. Several of them also visited the little town of Liverpool, built in a pleasant situation on the banks of the River George. Excursions too were made to the little villages of Richmond and Windsor, which were growing up near Hawkesbury River. At the same time, a party of the staff joined in a kangaroo hunt, and crossing the Blue Mountains penetrated the Bathurst settlement. Through the friendly relations which Freycinet had established with the residents during his 2 visits, he was able to collect numerous interesting details respecting the Australian colony. Therefore, the chapter that he devotes to New South Wales, recording the marvellous and rapid advance of this effort at colonisation, excited a lively interest in France, where the development and growing prosperity of Australia were very imperfectly known. Freycinet's narrative was there quite a new revelation, well calculated to excite inquiry, and which had moreover the advantage of showing the exact condition of the colony so late as the year 1825. The chain of mountains at some distance from the coast, known by the name of the Australian Alps, separates New South Wales from the interior of the Australian continent. For 25 years this chain formed a barrier against all communication with the country beyond, but now, thanks to the energy of Governor Macquarie, the barrier has been removed. A zigzag road has been cut in the rock, thus opening the way to the colonization of wide-spreading plains watered by important rivers. The loftiest summits of this chain, nearly 10,000 feet in height, are covered with snow even in the middle of summer. Whilst the elevation of the principal peaks, Mount Exmouth, Mount Cunningham and others was being taken, it was discovered that so far from Australia possessing only one large watercourse, the Swan River, it had several, the chief being Hawkesbury River, formed by the confluence of the Nepean, the Grose and the Brisbane, the River Murray not being yet known. At the period under notice a commencement had been made in the working of coal mines, slate quarries, layers of solid carbonate of iron, sandstone, chalk, porphyry and jasper, but the presence of gold, the metal that was to effect so rapid a development of the young colony, had not as yet been established. The nature of the soil varies. On the sea-coast it is barren, able only to support the growth of a few stunted trees, but inland the traveller meets with fields clothed with a rich vegetation, vast pasturages in which here and there rise a few tall shrubs, and forests where giant trees entwined with an inextricable growth of underwood defy all attempts to penetrate to their recesses. An Australian farm near the Blue Mountains. Facsimile of early engraving. One circumstance which much surprised travellers was the apparent homogeneity of race throughout the whole of this immense continent. Take the Aborigines at the Bay of Sharks, or in the land of Indracht, or by the Swan River, or at Port Jackson, and the same complexion, and the same kind of hair, the same features, the same physique, all prove indisputably that they have sprung from one common origin. Those dwelling by the rivers or on the sea-coast subsist chiefly on shell or other fish, but those living in the interior trust to hunting for their food, and will eat indiscriminately the flesh of the opossum or the kangaroo, not rejecting even lizards, snakes, worms or ants, the last named of which they manufacture into a sort of paste with the addition of their eggs and the roots of ferns. All over the continent, the practice of the Aborigines is to go completely naked. Though they have no objection to put on any articles of European clothing, that they can get possession of. It is said that in 1820 at Port Jackson, there was a laughable caricature of the European style of dress to be seen in the person of an ancient negress who went about clothed in some pieces of an old woolen blanket, wearing on her head a bonnet of green silk. A few of the Aborigines, however, make themselves cloaks of opossum or kangaroo skin, stitching the pieces together with the nerve fibers of the cassowary, but this kind of garment is of rare occurrence. Though their hair is smooth, they plaster it with grease and arrange it in curls. Then, inserting in the middle a tuft of grass, they raise a strange and comical superstructure, surmounted by a few cockatoo feathers, or failing these they fasten on, with the aid of a resinous gum, a few human teeth or some bits of bone, a dog's tail or one or two fish bones. Although the practice of tattooing is not much in favor among the natives of New Holland, some are occasionally to be seen who have succeeded by means of sharp shells in cutting symmetrical figures upon their skins. A more general custom is that of painting on their bodies monstrous designs in red and white colors, which, on their dark skins, give them an almost diabolical aspect. These savages formerly believed that after death they would take the form of children and be transported to the clouds or to the summits of lofty trees, where, in a sort of aerial paradise, they would be regaled with plentiful repasts. But since the arrival of the Europeans, their faith on this point has undergone some change, their present belief being that, metamorphosed into whites, they will go to inhabit some far-off land. It is also an article of their creed that the whites themselves are no other than their own ancestors, who, having been killed in battle, have assumed the form of Europeans. Native Australians. Native Australians. The census of 1819, one of the strictest hitherto instituted, gives the number of the colonists at 25,425. This return, it must be understood, does not take in the soldiers, the women being very much in the minority. The mother country had made efforts to remedy the inconvenience resulting from this great disparity of the sexes by promoting the immigration of young women, who soon married and founded families of a higher tone of morality than that of the convicts. Freycinet devotes a very long chapter in his narrative to all matters connected with political economy, the various soils and the crops suited to them, industrial pursuits, the breeding of cattle, farming economy, manufactures, foreign trade, means of communication, government. All these subjects are treated comprehensively on the authority of documents then newly compiled, and with an ability that could scarcely have been expected from a man who had not given special attention to questions of this nature. He has, moreover, added a close inquiry into the regimen which the convicts were subjected to from the time of their arrival in the colony, the punishments they had to undergo, as also the encouragements and rewards which were readily granted to them, when earned by good behavior. The chapter concludes with reflections full of learning and sound judgment on the probable development and future prosperity of the Australian colony. After this long and fruitful stay in New Holland, the Uranie put to sea on the 25th December, 1819, and steered so as to pass to the south of New Zealand and Campbell Island, with the view of doubling Cape Horn. A few days afterwards, 10 fugitive convicts were discovered on board, but the corvette had left the shores of Australia too far behind to allow of their restoration. The coast of Tierra del Fuego was reached without anything worthy of special notice having occurred during a very prosperous voyage, with a prevailing west wind. On the 5th February, Cape Desolation was sighted. Having doubled Cape Horn without any difficulty, the Uranie let go her anchor in the Bay of Good Success, where the shores, lined with grand forest trees and echoing to the sound of waterfalls, presented a scene totally different from the sterile desolation generally characterizing this quarter of the globe. No long stay was, however, made there. The corvette, resuming her voyage, lost no time in entering the Strait of Le Maire, notwithstanding a dense haze. Here she met with a heavy swell, a strong gale, and a mist so thick that land, sea, and sky were confounded in one general obscurity. The rain and the heavy spray raised by the storm, and the coming on of night, made it necessary to put the Uranie under a close-reefed topsail and jib, under which pressure of sail she behaved splendidly. The only available course was to run before the wind, and the travellers had just begun to feel thankful for their good fortune in being driven by the storm far away from the land, when the cry was heard, "Land close ahead." All hearts sunk with despair, shipwreck and death seemed inevitable. Freycinet alone, after a brief instant of hesitation, recovered his self-command. It was impossible that land could be ahead. He, therefore, kept on his northerly course, bearing a little east, and the correctness of his calculations was soon verified. On the next day but one the weather grew calmer. Observations were taken, and as they proved the vessel to have run a great distance from the Bay of Good Success, the commander had to choose between a detention off the coast of South America or off the Falkland Islands. The island of Conti, the Bay of Marville, and Cape Duras were successively observed through the haze, whilst a favourable breeze speeded the corvette on her course to Berkeley Sound, fixed on as the best place for the next halt. Mutual congratulations were already being exchanged on the happy termination of the dangerous struggle, and on the fortunate escape from any serious accident during so hazardous a trip. The sailors all rejoiced, to use the words of Byron, that the worst was over and the rest seemed sure. But a severe trial was still in store for them. On entering Berkeley Sound, every man was at his post, ready to let go the anchor. The lookouts were on the watch, men were stationed in the main shrouds to heave the lead. Then first at 20, after at 18 fathoms, the presence of rocks was reported. The ship was now about half a league offshore, and Freycinet thought it prudent to put her off about 2 points. This precaution proved fatal, for the corvette suddenly struck violently on a hidden rock. As she struck, the soundings gave 15 fathoms to starboard and 12 to larboard. The reef against which the corvette had run was therefore not so wide as the vessel itself. In fact, it was but the pointed summit of a rock. The immediate rising of pieces of wood to the surface of the water at once gave reason for fears that the injury was serious. There was a rush to the pumps. Water was pouring into the hold. Freycinet had sent for a sail, and had it passed under the vessel in such a manner that the pressure of the water forcing it into the leak in a measure stopped it up. But it was of no avail. Although the whole ship's company, officers and sailors alike, worked at the pumps, no more could be done than just keep the water from gaining on the vessel. There was nothing for it but to run her ashore. This decision, painful as it was, had to be carried out, and it was indeed no easy task. On every side the land was girded with rocks, and only at the very bottom of the bay was there a strip of sandy beach favourable for running the ship aground. Meanwhile the wind had become contrary, night was approaching, the vessel was already half full of water. The distress of the commander can be imagined, but there was no alternative, so the vessel was stranded on Penguin Island. This effected, to quote Freycinet, the men were so exhausted that it was necessary to cease further work of every kind, and to allow the crew an interval of rest, all the more indispensable on account of the hardships and dangers which our present disastrous situation must entail upon all. As for myself, repose was out of the question. Tormented by 1,000 harassing reflections, I could scarcely credit my own existence. The sudden transition from a position where all things seemed to smile on me, to that in which I found myself at that moment, weighed on my spirits like a horrible nightmare. It was difficult to regain the composure necessary to face fairly the painful trial. All my companions had done their duty in the frightful accident, which had all but lost us our lives, and I am glad to be able to do justice to their admirable conduct. As soon as daylight revealed the nature of the country, a mournful, gloomy look settled upon every countenance. Not a tree, not so much as a blade of grass was to be seen, not a sound was to be heard, and the silent desolation around reminded us of the Bay of Sharks. Berkeley Sound in the Falkland Islands. Berkeley Sound in the Falkland Islands. But there was no time to be lost in vain lamentations. Was the sea to be allowed to swallow up the journals and observations, the precious results of so much labour and so many hardships? All the papers were saved. The same good fortune did not, unfortunately, attend the collections. Several cases of specimens which were at the bottom of the hold were entirely lost. Others were damaged by the sea water. The collections that sustained the chief injury were those of natural history, and the herbarium that had been put together with infinite trouble by Gaudissot. The merino sheep, generously presented to the expedition by Mr. MacArthur of Sydney, which it was hoped could be acclimatized in France, were brought on shore, as also were all the animals still alive. A few tents were pitched, first for the sick, happily not very numerous, and then for the officers and the crew. The provisions and ammunition taken out of the ship were carefully deposited in a place where they would be sheltered from the inclemency of the weather. The alcoholic liquors were allowed to remain on board until the time arrived for quitting the scene of the shipwreck, and during the 3 months of the expedition's stay here, not a single theft of rum or of brandy came to light, although no one had anything to drink but pure water. The efforts of the whole of the expedition were steadily applied to the task of trying to repair the main injuries sustained by the Uranie. With the exception of a few sailors told off to provide, by hunting and fishing, for the subsistence of the community. The lakes were frequented by numbers of sea lions, geese, ducks, teal and snipe, But it was no easy matter to procure, at one time, a sufficient quantity of these animals to serve for the food of the entire crew. At the same time, the expenditure of powder was necessarily considerable. As good luck would have it, gulls abounded in sufficient numbers to furnish 120 men with food for 4 or 5 months, and these creatures were so stupid as to allow themselves to be knocked on the head with a stick. A few horses were also killed, which had relapsed into a wild state since the departure of the colony founded by Bougainville. By the 28th February, the painful conclusion was come to, that with the slender resources available, it was impracticable to repair the damage done to the Uranie, especially as the original injury had been aggravated by the repeated shocks occasioned by thumping on the beach. What was to be done? Should the explorers calmly wait until some vessel chanced to put in at Berkeley Sound? This would be to leave the sailors with nothing to do, and this enforced idleness would open the door to disorder and insubordination. Would it not be better to build a small vessel out of the wreckage of the Uranie? As it happened, there was a large sloop belonging to the ship. If the sides were raised and a deck added, it might be possible to reach Montevideo, and there obtain the assistance of a vessel capable of bringing off in safety the members of the expedition and all the cargo worth preserving. This latter plan met with the approval of Freycinet, and a decision once come to, not a moment was wasted. The sailors, animated with fresh energy, rapidly pushed on the work. Now was proved the sound judgment of the commander when manning the corvette at Toulon, in selecting sailors who were also skilled in some mechanical employment. Blacksmiths, sailmakers, rope-makers, sawyers, all worked with zeal at the different tasks assigned to them. No doubts were entertained of the success of the voyage before them. Montevideo was separated from the Falkland Islands by but 350 nautical miles, and with the winds prevailing in these latitudes at this time of year, this distance could be traversed in a few days by the Esperance, for so the transformed sloop was named, to provide at the same time against the possible contingency of the frail vessel failing to reach the Rio de la Plata. Freycinet determined to commence the construction of a schooner of 100 tons, as soon as the sloop had taken her departure. Notwithstanding the incessant demands on the energies of all made by the arduous and varied tasks involved in reconstruction and refitting of the new vessel, the usual astronomical and physical observations, the natural history researches, and the hydrographical surveys were not neglected. No one could have imagined that the stay in Berkeley Sound was anything more than an ordinary halt for exploring purposes. At last the sloop was finished and safely launched. The instructions for Captain Duperrey appointed to take command were all drawn up, the crew was selected, the provisions were on board. In 2 days the adventurers were to sail, when on the 19th March 1820 the cry was raised, "A sail! A sail!" A sloop under full sail was seen entering the bay. A cannon was fired several times to attract attention, and in a short time the master of the new arrival was on shore. In a few words Freycinet explained to him the misadventure which had led to the residence of the explorers upon this desolate coast. The master stated in reply that he was under the orders of the captain of an American ship, the General Knox, engaged in the seal fishery at West Island, to the west of the Falklands. An officer was at once deputed to go and ascertain from the captain what succor he could render to the French travellers. The result of the interview was a demand for 135,750 francs for the conveyance of the shipwrecked strangers to Rio, an unworthy advantage to take of the necessities of the unfortunate. To such a bargain, the French officer was unwilling to agree without the consent of his commander, so he begged the American captain to sail for Berkeley Sound. While these negotiations were going on, however, another ship, the Mercury under command of Captain Galvin, had made its appearance in the bay. The Mercury was bound from Buenos Aires to Valparaiso with cannon, but just before doubling Cape Horn she had sprung a leak, and was compelled to put in at the Falkland Islands to make the necessary repairs. It was a fortunate incident for the Frenchmen, who knew they could turn to account the competition which must result from the arrival of 2 ships. The Mercury at anchor in Berkeley Sound. The Mercury at anchor in Berkeley Sound. Freycinet at once made an offer to Captain Galvin to repair the damage the Mercury had sustained, with the materials and the labour at his command, asking in return for this service a free passage for himself and his companions to Rio de Janeiro. At the end of 15 days the repairs of the Mercury were completed. While they were going on, the negotiation with the General Knox was terminated by a positive refusal on the part of Freycinet to agree to the extravagant terms proposed by the American captain. It took several days to come to a settlement with Captain Galvin, who finally made the following agreement. Before leaving the Falklands, however, the naturalist Godisho planted its destitute shores with several sorts of vegetables, which he thought likely to be of service to future voyagers who might be detained there. A few particulars regarding this archipelago will not be without interest. The group, lying between 50 degrees 57 and degrees 45 S latitude and degrees 4, 63 degrees 48 west of the meridian of Paris, consists of several islets and two principal islands, named Conti and Maidenland. Berkeley Sound, situated in the extreme east of the Conti Island, is a wide opening, rather deep than extensive, with a shelving rocky coast. The temperature of the islands is milder than one would expect from the high latitude. Snow does not fall in any great quantity, and does not remain even on the summits of the highest hills longer than for about 2 months. The streams are never frozen, and the lakes and marshes are never covered with ice hard enough to bear the weight of a man for more than 24 hours consecutively. From the observations of Weddell, who visited these parts between 1822 and the temperature must have risen considerably during the last 40 years in consequence of a change in the direction taken by the icebergs which melt away in the mid-Atlantic. M. Coy, the naturalist, judging from the shallowness of the sea between the Falkland Islands and South America, as well as the resemblance of their grassy plains to the pampas of Buenos Aires, is of opinion that they once formed part of the continent. These plains are low, marshy, covered with tall grass and shrubs, and are inundated in the winter. Peat is abundant and makes excellent fuel. The character of the soil has proved an obstacle to the growth of the trees, which Bougainville endeavored to acclimatize, of which scarce a vestige remained at the time of Freycinet's visit. The plant which reaches the greatest height and grows most plentifully is a species of sword grass, excellent food for cattle, and serving also as a place of shelter to numbers of seals and multitudes of gulls. It is this high grass which sailors have taken from a distance for bushes. The only vegetables growing on these islands of any use to man are celery, scurvy grass, watercress, dandelion, raspberries, sorrel, and pimpernel. Both French and Spanish colonists had at different times imported into these islands oxen, horses, and pigs, which had multiplied to a singular extent in the island of Conti. But the persistent hunting of them by the crews of the whaling ships must tend to considerably reduce their numbers. The only quadruped indigenous to the Falkland Islands is the Antarctic dog, the muzzle of which strikingly resembles that of the fox. It has therefore had the name dog fox or wolf fox given to it by whalers. These animals are so fierce that they rushed into the water to attack Byron's sailors. They, however, find rabbits enough, whose reproductive powers are limitless, to satisfy them, but the seals, which the dogs attack without any fear, manage to escape from them. The Mercury set sail on the 28th of April, 1821, to convey Freycinet and his crew to the port of Rio de Janeiro. But one point Captain Galvin had failed to take into his reckoning. His ship, equipped under the flag of the independent state of Buenos Aires, then at war with the Portuguese, would be seized on entering the harbour of Rio, and he himself with all his crew would be made prisoners. On this he endeavoured to make Freycinet cancel the engagement between them, hoping to prevail on him to land at Montevideo. But as Freycinet would not agree to this proposal on any ground, a new contract had to be substituted for the original one. According to the latter arrangement, Freycinet became proprietor of the Mercury on behalf of the French Navy by payment of the sum stipulated under the first contract. The ship was renamed the Physician and reached Montevideo on the 8th of May, where the command was taken over by Freycinet. The stay at Montevideo was made use of for arming the vessel, arranging its trim, repairing the rigging, taking on board the supply of water and provisions requisite for the trip to Rio de Janeiro. Before reaching which port, however, several serious defects in the ship had been discovered. The appearance of the Physician was so distinctly mercantile that on entering the port of Rio, though the flag of a man-o'-war was flying at the masthead, the customs officers were deceived and proposed to inspect her as a merchant vessel. Extensive repairs were absolutely necessary, and the making of them compelled Freycinet to remain at Rio until the 18th of September. He was then able to take his departure direct for France, and on the 13th of November, 1820, he cast anchor in the port of Havre, after an absence of 3 years and 2 months, during which time he had sailed over 18,862 nautical miles. A few days after his return, Freycinet proceeded to Paris, suffering from a severe illness, and forwarded to the Secretary of the Academy of Sciences the scientific records of the voyage, which made no less than 31 quarto volumes. At the same time, the naturalists attached to the expedition, McCoy, Gaimard, and Godisho, submitted the specimens which they had collected. Among these were 4 previously unknown species of mammiferous animals, 45 of fishes, 30 of reptiles, besides rare kinds of mollusks, polyps, annelids, and sea. The rules of the French service required that Freycinet should be summoned before a council of war to answer for the loss of his ship. The trial terminated in a unanimous verdict of acquittal from all blame, the council expressing at the same time their hearty acknowledgement of the energy and ability displayed by the commander, approving, moreover, the skillful and careful measures he had taken to remedy the disastrous results of his shipwreck. A few days after being received by the King Louis Roman XVIII, His Majesty, accompanying him to the door, said, "You entered here the captain of a frigate, you depart the captain of a ship of the line. Offer me no thanks, reply in the words used by Jean Bart to Louis Roman XIV, Sire, you have done well." From that time, Freycinet devoted himself entirely to the task of publishing the notes of his travels. The meagre account which has been given here will serve to show how extensive these notes were, but the extreme conscientiousness of the explorer prevented him from publishing anything which was not complete, and he was bent on placing his work in advance of the recognized boundaries of knowledge at that date. Even the mere classification of the vast quantity of material which he had collected during his voyage demanded a large expenditure of time. Thus it was that when surprised by death on the 18th of August, 1842, he had not put the last finishing touch to one of the most curious and novel divisions of his work, that relating to the languages of Oceania, with special reference to that of the Marian Islands. At the close of the year 1821, the Marquis de Clermont-Tonnerre, then Minister of Marine, received the scheme of a new voyage from 2 young officers, Duperrey and Dumont d'Urville, the former second in command to Freycinet on board the Uranie, after having rendered valuable assistance to the expedition by his scientific researches and surveys, had within the year returned to France. The other, the colleague of Captain Garnier, had brought himself into notice during the hydrographical cruises in the Mediterranean and Black Seas, which it had fallen to Captain Garnier to complete. He had a fine taste for botany and art, and had been one of the first to draw attention to the artistic value of the Venus of Milos, which had just been discovered. These 2 young savants proposed in the plans submitted by them to make special researches into 3 departments of natural science: magnetism, meteorology, and the configuration of the globe. "In the geographical department," said Duperrey, "we would propose to verify or to rectify, either by direct or by chronometrical observations, the position of a great number of points in different parts of the globe, especially among the numerous island groups of the Pacific Ocean, notorious for shipwrecks and so remarkable for the character and the form of the shoals, sandbanks, and reefs, of which they in part consist, also to trace new routes through the dangerous archipelago and the Society Islands, side by side with those taken by Quiros, Wallis, Bougainville, and Cook, to carry on hydrographical surveys in continuation of those made in the voyages of 500 Entrecasteaux and of Freycinet in Polynesia, New Holland, and the Molucca Islands, and particularly to visit the Caroline Islands, discovered by Magellan, about which, with the exception of the eastern side, examined in our own time by Captain Kotzebue, we have only very vague information, communicated by the missionaries, and by them learnt from stories told by savages who had lost their way and were driven in their canoes upon the Marian Islands. The languages, character, and customs of these islanders must also receive special and careful attention. The naval doctors, Garnon and Lesson, were placed in charge of the natural history department, whilst the staff was composed of officers most remarkable for their scientific attainments, among whom may be mentioned Lesage, Jacquinot, Berard, Lawton, de Blois, and de Blosseville. The Academy of Sciences took up the plan of research submitted by the originators of this expedition with much enthusiasm, and furnished them with minute instructions, in which were set forth with care the points on which accurate scientific information was especially desirable. At the same time, the instruments supplied to the explorers were the most finished and complete of their kind. The vessel chosen for the expedition was the Coquille, a small ship, not drawing more than from 12 to 13 feet of water, which was lying in ordinary at Toulon. The time spent in refitting, stowing the cargo, arming the ship, prevented the expedition from starting earlier than the 11th of August, 1822. The island of Tenerife was reached on the 28th of the same month, and there the officers hoped to be able to make a few gleanings after the rich harvest of knowledge which their predecessors had reaped. But the Council of Health in the island, having received information of an outbreak of yellow fever on the shores of the Mediterranean, imposed on the Coquille a quarantine of 15 days. It happened, however, that at that period political opinion was in a state of fervid excitement at Tenerife, and party spirit ran so high in society that the inhabitants found it hard to come together without also coming to blows. Under these circumstances, it is easy to imagine that the French officers did not indulge in violent regrets over the privations which they had to sustain. The 8 days during which their stay at Tenerife lasted were given up exclusively to the revictualling of the ship, and to magnetic and astronomical observations. Towards the end of September anchor was weighed, and on the 6th of October the work of surveying the islands of Martin Vaz and of Trinidad was commenced. The former are nothing more than bare rocks rising out of the sea, of a most forbidding aspect. The island of Trinidad is high land, rugged and barren, with a few trees crowning the southern point. This island is none other than the famous Asencao, now called Ascension, which for 3 centuries had been the object of exploring research. In 1700, it was taken possession of by the celebrated Halley in the name of the English government, but it had to be ceded to the Portuguese, who formed a settlement there. La Perouse found it still in existence at the same place in 1785. The settlement, which turned out expensive and useless, was abandoned a short time after the visit just referred to, and the island was left in the occupation of the dogs, pigs, and goats, whose progenitors had entered the island in company with the early colonists. When he left the island of Trinidad, Duperrey purposed to steer a direct course for the Falkland Islands, but an accidental damage in the repair of which no time was to be lost compelled him to alter his course for the island of St. Catherine, where only he could obtain without any delay the wood required for new yards and masts, as well as provisions, which from their abundance could there be bought very cheap. As he drew near to the island, he was delighted with the grand and picturesque scene presented by its dense forests, where laurel trees, sassafras, cedars, orange trees, and mangroves intermingled with banana and other palms, with their feathery foliage waving gracefully in the breeze. Just 4 days before the corvette anchored off St. Catherine, Brazil had cast off the authority of the mother country and declared its independence by the proclamation of Prince Don Pedro d'Alcantara as emperor. This led the commander to dispatch a mission consisting of d'Urville, de Blossville, Gabert, and Garnot to the capital of the island, Nossa Senhora del Desterro, to make inquiries about the political change and learn how far it might modify the friendly relations of the country with France. It appeared that the administration of the province was in the hands of a junto, but orders were at once given to allow the French travellers to cut what wood they might stand in need of, and the governor of the fort of Santa Cruz was requested to further the scientific inquiries of the expedition by all the means at his command. As to provisions, however, there was considerable difficulty, for the merchants had transferred their funds to Rio, in apprehension of what the political change might result in. It is probable that this circumstance accounts for the commander of the Coquille finding the course of business not run smooth in a port which had received the warm recommendations of Captains Krusenstern and Kotzebue. The narrative of the travellers states that the inhabitants were living in expectation of the island being shortly attacked with the view to recolonization, which they considered would be tantamount to their enslavement. The decree issued on the 1st August, 1822, calling on all Brazilians to arm themselves for the defense of their shores, and proclaiming under all circumstances a war of partisans had given rise to these fears. The measures which Prince Don Pedro propounded were equally generous and vigorous, and had created a favourable opinion of his character and of his desire to promote freedom. Full of confidence in his purposes, the strong party in favour of independence were filled with enthusiasm expressing itself all the more boisterously, as for so long a time their fervid aspirations had been kept under restraint. They now gave open demonstration of their joy by making the towns of Nossa Senhora del Desterro, Laguna, and San Francisco one blaze of light with their illuminations, and marching through the streets singing verses in honour of Don Pedro. But the excitement which had been thus strikingly manifested in the towns was not shared by the quiet peace-loving dwellers in the rural districts, to whose breasts political passion was an entire stranger. And there cannot be a doubt that, if Portugal had been in a position to enforce her decrees by the dispatch of a fleet, the province would have been easily reconquered. The Coquille set sail again on the 30th October. When to the east of Rio de la Plata she was caught in one of those formidable gales, there called Pampero, but had the good fortune to weather it without sustaining any damage. While in this part of the ocean Duperrey made some interesting observations on the current of the Plate River. Freycinet had already established the fact of its flowing at the rate of 2 miles and a half an hour, at a distance of 100 leagues to the east of Montevideo. It was reserved to the commander of the Coquille to ascertain that the current is sensibly felt at a much greater distance. He proved moreover that the water of the river resisted by that of the ocean is forcibly divided into two branches running in the direction of the two banks of the river at its mouth. And finally he accounts for the comparative shallowness of the sea down to the shores of the Magellan Strait by the immense residuum of earth held in suspension by the waters of the La Plata and deposited daily along the coast of South America. Before entering Berkeley Sound, the Cartwheel, driven by a favorable breeze, passed immense shoals of whales and dolphins, flocks of gulls and numerous flying fish, the ordinary tenants of those tempestuous regions. The Falkland Isles were reached, and Duperrey with a few of his fellow travellers felt a lively pleasure at revisiting the land, which had been to them a place of refuge for 3 months after their shipwreck in the Uranie. They paid a visit to the spot where the camp had been pitched. The remains of the corvette were almost entirely embedded in sand, and what was visible of it bore marks of the appropriations which had been made by the whalers who had followed them in that place. On all sides were scattered miscellaneous fragments, carronades with the knobs broken off, pieces of the rigging, tattered clothes, shreds of sails, unrecognizable rags, mingled with the bones of the animals which the castaways had killed for food. This scene of our recent calamity, Duperrey observes, wore an aspect of desolation which was rendered still gloomier by the barrenness of the land and the dark rainy weather prevailing at the time of our visit. Nevertheless, it had for us an inexplicable sort of attraction, and left a melancholy impression on our minds, which was not effaced till long after we had left the Falkland Islands well behind us. The wreck of the Uranie. The wreck of the Uranie. The stay of Duperrey at the Falklands was prolonged to the 17th December. He took up his residence in the midst of the ruins of the settlement founded by Bougainville, in order to execute certain repairs which the condition of his vessel required. The crew provided themselves by fishing and hunting with an ample supply of food. Everything necessary was found in abundance, except fruit and vegetables, and having laid in abundant stores, all prepared to confront the dangers of the passage round Cape Horn. At first the Cartwheel had to struggle against strong winds from the southwest and violent currents. These were succeeded by squalls and hazy weather, until the island of Mocha was reached on the 19th January, 1823. Of this island a brief mention has already been made. Duperrey places it in 38 degrees 20-30 S lat, and degrees 21-55 W long, and reckons it to be about 24 miles in circumference. Consisting of a chain of mountains of moderate elevation, sloping down towards the sea, it was the rendezvous of the early explorers of the Pacific. It furnished the ships touching there, now a merchantman, now a pirate, with horses and with wild pigs, the flesh of which had a well-known reputation for delicacy of flavour. Here was also a good supply of pure fresh water, as well as of some European fruits, such as apples, peaches and cherries, the growth of trees planted here by those who first took possession of the island. In 1823, however, these resources had all but disappeared, through the wasteful practices of improvident whalers. At no great distance might be seen the two round eminences which mark the mouth of the river Biobio, the small island of Quebralas, and that of Quiriquina. And these passed, the Bay of Conception opened to view, where was a solitary English whaler about to double the Cape, to which was entrusted the correspondence for home, as well as the notes of the work that had already been accomplished. On the day after the arrival of the Cartwheel, as soon as the morning sun had lit up the bay, the melancholy and desolate appearance of the place, which had taken everyone by surprise on the previous evening, became still more depressing. The name of the town was Talcahuano, and the picture it presented was one of houses in ruins and silent streets. A few wretched canoes ready to fall to pieces were on the beach. Near them loitered a few poorly clad fishermen, while in front of the tumble-down cottages and roofless huts sat women in rags employed in combing one another's hair. In contrast with this human squalor, the surrounding hills and woods, the gardens and the orchards, were clothed in the most splendid foliage. On every side flowers displayed their gorgeous colours, and fruits proclaimed their ripeness in tints of gold. Overhead a glowing sun, a sky without a cloud, completed the bitter irony of the spectacle. All this ruin, desolation and wretchedness were the outward and visible signs of a series of revolutions. At St. Catherine the French travellers had been witnesses of the declaration of Brazilian independence. On the opposite side of the continent, they were spectators of the downfall of Director O'Higgins. This official had evaded the summons of the Congress, had sacrificed the interests of the agricultural community to those of the traders and merchants, by the imposition of direct taxes and the lowering of customs duties. was openly accused, as well as his ministers, of peculation, and as the result of all this malversation, the greater part of the population had risen in revolt. The movement against O'Higgins was led by a General D. Ramon Frere y Serrano, who gave formal assurances to the explorers that the political disturbance should be no impediment to the revictualling of the Coquille. On the 26th January 2 corvettes arrived at Conception. They brought a regiment under the command of a French official, Colonel Beauchef, who came to assist General Frere. The regiment, which had been organized by the exertions of Colonel Beauchef, was in point of steadiness, discipline, and knowledge of drill, one of the smartest in the Chilean army. On the 2nd February, the officers of the Coquille proceeded to Conception to pay a visit to General Frere. The nearer they approached the city, the more fields were lying waste, the more ruined houses were seen, the fewer people were visible, while their clothing had almost reached the vanishing point. At the entrance of the town itself stood a mast, with the head of a notorious bandit affixed to the top, one Benavides, a ferocious savage, more wild beast than man, whose name was long execrated in Chile for the horrible atrocities he had committed. The interior of the town was found as desolate in appearance as the approach to it, having been set fire to by each party that had successively been victorious. Conception was nothing more than a heap of ruins, amongst which loitered a little remnant of scantily clothed inhabitants, the wretched residuum of a once flourishing population. Grass was growing in the streets. The bishop's palace and the cathedral were the only buildings still standing, and these, roofless and gutted, would not be able much longer to resist the dilapidating influence of the climate. General Frere, before placing himself in opposition to O'Higgins, had arranged a peace with the Araucanians, an indigenous tribe distinguished for their bravery, who had not only maintained their own independence but were always ready, when opportunity offered, to encroach on the Spanish territory. Some of these natives were employed as auxiliary troops in the Chilean army. Duperrey saw them, and, having obtained from General Frere and Colonel Beauchef trustworthy information, has given a not very flattering description of them, of which the substance shall be here given. The Araucanians are of an ordinary stature, in complexion copper-coloured, with small, black, vivacious eyes, a rather flat nose and thick lips, the result of which is an expression of brutal ferocity, divided into tribes, each one jealous of another, all animated by an unbridled lust of plunder, and ever on the move. Their lives are spent in perpetual warfare. The mounted Araucanian is armed with a long lance, a long cutlass sabre-shaped called a machete, 5 and the lasso, in the use of which they are extremely expert, while the horse he rides is usually swift.